The judge's phone buzzed again. Another message from his clerk about more cities requesting program information. The movement was spreading, growing beyond what anyone had imagined that rainy night 2 years ago. Each new request represented another chance for positive change, another community ready to build bridges instead of walls. As the sun set over the city, the judge took one last look at the statistics on his desk. But it wasn't the numbers that made him smile. It was remembering the morning scene outside his window, that simple interaction between an officer and a citizen, the natural ease of their conversation, the absence of fear or suspicion on either side. That night, driving home along the same street where it all began, the judge passed a community basketball game. Officers and residents played together under the lights, their laughter carrying through the evening air. A small crowd watched from the sidelines, cheering for both teams equally. No one seemed to notice or care who wore a uniform and who didn't. This, he thought, was the real legacy of that rainy night, not just changes in policy or procedure, but changes in hearts and minds. What had started as one difficult moment had grown into thousands of positive ones, each small interaction building a stronger, safer, more united community. The judge parked his car and looked up at the stars. Sometimes the best kind of justice, he realized, wasn't found in a courtroom at all. Sometimes it was found in the simple act of seeing each other's humanity and choosing to build something better together. 2 years had passed since that rainy night when a routine traffic stop changed everything. The judge sat in his office, reviewing a thick stack of reports from police departments across the state. Each one told the same story: communities healing, trust rebuilding, and a new way of thinking about law enforcement taking root. The morning news played quietly on his office TV, showing footage of yesterday's graduation ceremony. 50 new officers had completed their training under the new program, which was now mandatory for every police recruit in the city. The camera panned across the stage where the young officer, now a sergeant and lead trainer, stood alongside community leaders, all of them beaming with pride. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered with more letters from other cities requesting information about implementing the program. "They're calling it the Justice Bridge Project now," she said, placing the letters on his desk. The governor's office called again. "They want to make it a statewide standard." The judge smiled, remembering how it all began. That night could have ended so differently, with anger, with headlines, with deeper divisions. Instead, it had sparked something remarkable. The statistics told part of the story. Complaints against officers down by 60%, community cooperation up by 75%, crime rates dropping in neighborhoods where the program was most active. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the small moments that happened every day across the city. Like the time a local bakery owner had a health emergency and 3 officers who regularly stopped by his shop took turns checking on his store until he recovered. Or the community cleanup day where you couldn't tell officers from residents because everyone was wearing the same volunteer t-shirts and working side by side. The judge walked to his window, watching people move about the courthouse plaza below. A police officer was helping an elderly man with directions, both of them smiling and chatting like old friends. These simple interactions, once rare, had become everyday occurrences. His phone buzzed with a message from the sergeant, the same officer he'd met that rainy night. "Turn on Channel 5, it read. "You need to see this." The judge switched channels just in time to see the start of a special report. The camera showed a familiar scene, a traffic stop at night. But this one was different. The officer approached the car with respect, explained the reason for the stop clearly, and treated the driver with dignity. The reporter's voice explained how this was just one example of the changes brought about by the Justice Bridge Project. The segment continued with interviews from community members. A teenager talked about how officers now came to their school as mentors, not just authority figures. A shop owner described feeling safer knowing officers who understood her community were watching out for her business. Even former critics of the police department admitted things had improved. Later that afternoon, the judge attended a community council meeting. The room looked different from 2 years ago. Police officers and residents sat mixed together, not divided into opposing groups. They weren't just discussing problems anymore. They were planning neighborhood festivals, youth programs, and job training initiatives. The sergeant stood up to give his monthly report, and the judge couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. Gone was the defensive young officer from that traffic stop. In his place stood a confident leader who had earned the community's trust. He spoke about recent successes, a youth mentoring program that had helped 20 kids get into college, a new community safety initiative designed with resident input, a series of town halls that had led to real policy changes. But our biggest success, the sergeant said, isn't something we can put in a report. It's the fact that my own kids now tell me they want to be police officers. Not because of the badge or the authority, but because they see how we're helping our community grow stronger. After the meeting, people lingered to chat, sharing stories and making plans. The judge overheard a conversation between two older residents, one a retired officer, the other a longtime community activist. They were planning a joint presentation for the next police academy class, sharing their perspectives on how far things had come. The judge, who'd been quietly observing from the back of the room, watched as the young officer handled questions from the community. Gone was the defensive stance, the automatic authority in his voice. Instead, he listened more than he spoke, acknowledged concerns without getting defensive, and shared both successes and ongoing challenges honestly. During a quiet moment, the officer found himself looking at his reflection in the library window. His uniform was the same, his badge still shone in the evening light, but he saw himself differently now. The program hadn't just changed how he did his job, it had changed how he understood his role in the community. A group of teens walked past, calling out greetings to him by name. 6 months ago, they might have avoided eye contact. Now, one of them was on his basketball team, another was helping organize a community cleanup day. Small changes, maybe, but they added up to something bigger. The evening ended with a planning session for the next phase of the program. The officer sat between a local teacher and a retired police sergeant, all of them brainstorming ways to reach more people. Ideas flowed freely: mentoring programs, community gardens, joint training sessions where officers and residents could learn new skills together. As he drove home that night, the officer reflected on how far he'd come from that rainy evening when he pulled over the judge's car. What could have been the end of his career had instead become a beginning, not just for him, but for his whole department and the community they served. His phone buzzed with a message from the youth center director, photos from that day's basketball practice, kids and officers grinning together on the court. He smiled, thinking about how many small moments like these were happening across the city now, each one helping to build something stronger than fear or mistrust. Genuine understanding. 6 months into the program, the young officer stood before a new class of police academy recruits. His hands weren't shaking anymore when he told his story. He'd shared it so many times now that it had become a powerful teaching tool rather than a source of shame. The classroom was quiet except for the soft sound of pens scratching against notepads as the recruits took notes. "I thought I was doing my job that night," he explained, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "I saw an expensive car in what I considered a suspicious area, and I made assumptions. What I didn't see was the person behind the wheel, a respected judge who'd spent the whole day serving our community." A recruit raised her hand. "But how do you balance being cautious with not making assumptions? We're taught to be alert for suspicious activity." The officer nodded, remembering how he'd struggled with the same question. "That's exactly what I've learned to think about differently," he said. "What makes something suspicious? Is it really about the situation, or is it about our own biases?" He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from before and after the program began. Complaint numbers had dropped significantly, while positive community interactions had increased. But it was the personal stories that really showed the change. "Last week," he continued, "I was patrolling the same neighborhood where I stopped the judge. I saw a teenager running down the street. 6 months ago, I might have immediately thought something was wrong. Instead, I remembered what we learned in the program to see the whole picture." The recruits leaned forward as he described pulling over to check on the boy, discovering he was racing to get home before dark because he'd lost track of time at basketball practice. "I gave him a ride home," the officer said. "His mom invited me in for coffee. Turns out she's on the neighborhood watch committee. Now we have a new connection in that community." During the break, several recruits gathered around him, asking questions about specific situations they'd encountered during their training. The officer noticed how different their questions were from the ones his own class had asked just a year ago. These future officers weren't just asking about procedures and protocols, They wanted to know about building relationships and understanding different perspectives. Later that day, he joined a community meeting at the local library. The same grandmother who'd spoken at the first training session was there, but now she greeted him with a warm hug. She'd become one of the program's strongest advocates, often bringing officers and community members together for informal dinners at her house. "Tell them about the basketball league," she urged, nudging him toward the microphone. The officer smiled, remembering how that project had started. After learning that many local kids didn't have safe places to play after school, he'd worked with other officers and community leaders to start a youth basketball program. Officers and residents coached together, turning the community center court into a place where badges didn't matter as much as teaching kids a good jump shot. "We're not just enforcing laws anymore," he explained to the gathered residents. "We're part of this community. When I walk my beat now, people wave. They know my name. They tell me about their concerns, but they also share their good news. That's what real policing should be." A local business owner stood up to share how his perspective had changed. "I used to tense up every time a patrol car drove by my store," he admitted. "Now, I know most of the officers by name. They stop in for coffee, they know my customers, they're part of our neighborhood's fabric." The training director appeared with a stack of feedback forms, his face bright with excitement. "The responses are incredible," he reported. "Everyone wants to know when we're doing the next session. The chief is already talking about making this a permanent part of officer training." Outside, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of hope. The judge watched as officers and community members walked to their cars together, still deep in conversation. A few were making plans for coffee, others exchanging ideas for community projects. The young officer stayed behind to help stack chairs, working alongside the grandmother who'd spoken earlier. Their casual conversation about local restaurants and family recipes echoed through the emptying room, a simple interaction that would have seemed impossible just hours before. As the judge gathered his materials, he found a note left on the podium. In neat handwriting, someone had written, "Thank you for helping us see each other as human beings again." He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket, a small reminder that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding. Back in his chambers later that evening, the judge added the note to a growing file of feedback and observations. The program was just beginning, but already he could see ripples of change spreading through the department and the community. What had started as a tense traffic stop was transforming into something that might just help heal decades of mistrust and misunderstanding. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as 30 police officers sat alongside 30 community leaders for the first session of the new program. The young officer who'd sparked this initiative sat in the front row, his uniform crisp but his posture betraying his unease. 3 months had passed since that rainy night, and what had started as a simple traffic stop had grown into something much bigger. The judge stood at the podium, looking out over the diverse group. Some faces showed skepticism, others hope, and many simply looked uncertain about what to expect. He'd seen that same mix of expressions countless times in his courtroom, but this was different. This wasn't about judgment, it was about building bridges. "Today isn't about pointing fingers," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's about understanding each other's stories." He gestured to the chairs arranged in a large circle rather than traditional rows. "That's why we're sitting like this. No barriers, no sides, just people ready to listen and learn." A local shop owner raised her hand, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I've been running my store for 30 years, she said. "I've seen how things have changed, good and bad. But I've never sat down with police officers like this before." The young officer who'd pulled the judge over that night shifted in his seat. In the months since the incident, he'd been helping design this program, turning his mistake into a catalyst for change. Now, watching the shop owner speak, he could see why this mattered so much. The morning sessions started with simple exercises, having participants share their daily routines, their fears, their hopes for their community. A veteran officer described his struggle to balance safety with community trust. A local pastor talked about counseling young people who felt targeted. The conversations weren't easy, but they were real. During the lunch break, the judge watched as small groups formed naturally. The young officer sat with a community activist, their conversation animated but respectful. Nearby, a senior officer shared photos of his grandkids with a neighborhood council member. These small moments of connection were exactly what the program aimed to create. The afternoon brought the more challenging exercises. Body camera footage from various incidents played on the screen, followed by honest discussions about what went right, what went wrong, and how things could have been handled differently. The young officer shared his own story, the traffic stop that had led to this program, his voice steady as he acknowledged his biases and described his journey to understanding. A grandmother stood up, her gray hair catching the afternoon light. "I've been afraid every time my grandson drives at night," she admitted, her words making several officers look down at their hands. "But sitting here today, seeing you all as people, hearing your stories, it helps." The training director introduced the next phase, ride-alongs, but with a twist. Officers would spend time in community members' shoes, attending neighborhood meetings, visiting local businesses, understanding daily life from a different perspective. Community members would also get a chance to see the challenges officers faced during their shifts. As the day wound down, the judge noticed something had shifted in the room. The initial tension had eased, replaced by something that felt like the beginning of understanding. People lingered after the session ended, exchanging contact information, making plans to continue conversations. The young officer approached the judge as everyone was leaving. "I never thought that night would lead to this," he said, gesturing at the room where small groups still chatted. "I was so scared when I recognized who you were, but now," he paused, searching for words. "Now you see it wasn't about who I was," the judge finished gently. "It was about who we all are and who we can become." A local youth mentor joined their conversation, adding her perspective. "My kids need to see this," she said. "They need to know that change is possible, that we can work together." "I've asked Mr. Chan to join us because he'll be crucial to implementing this," the judge explained. "We need to make this program part of the department's DNA, not just another box to check." The next hour flew by as they outlined the basics of the program. The young officer grew more engaged as time went on, eventually offering his own suggestions based on his recent experience. The chief took extensive notes, occasionally making calls to bring in other department heads for consultation. By the time they wrapped up, the morning sun had climbed high over the city. The judge looked at the group assembled in his chambers, the young officer who'd pulled him over, now animated with ideas for change. The lieutenant and chief deep in discussion about implementation, the training director already sketching out curriculum plans. Something had shifted in that room. What could have been a story of conflict and punishment had become a catalyst for transformation. The judge smiled slightly, thinking of all the times he told young lawyers that justice wasn't just about penalties, it was about creating positive change. As they prepared to leave, the young officer hung back for a moment. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "thank you. Not just for not filing the complaint, but for," he struggled to find the words. The judge nodded understanding. "Sometimes our mistakes can lead us to our most important work," he said. "What matters is what we choose to do next." The next morning arrived with surprising clarity after a night of little sleep. The judge sat in his chambers, early as usual, watching the sun climb over the city skyline through his window. His phone lay on the desk, the recorded video from last night still unopened. He'd spent hours thinking about how to handle this situation, knowing his decision would ripple far beyond just one traffic stop. A gentle knock on his door announced his clerk's arrival with fresh coffee. "The officers are here, Your Honor," she said quietly, placing the steaming cup on his desk. "And the police chief called. He'd like to join the meeting if you'll allow it." The judge nodded, taking a thoughtful sip of coffee. Word traveled fast in their city's justice system. He'd expected nothing less. "Send them all in," he said, standing to arrange 4 chairs in a semicircle rather than across his desk. This wasn't going to be an interrogation or a lecture. It needed to be something different. The young officer from last night entered first, looking like he hadn't slept either. His uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who'd spent the night replaying events over and over. The lieutenant followed, then the police chief, his presence adding an extra layer of significance to the gathering. "Please, sit down." The judge gestured to the chairs. He remained standing, looking at each person in turn. "I imagine everyone's wondering why we're here instead of in a formal hearing." The young officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The chief leaned forward slightly, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. The lieutenant sat perfectly still, watching everything. Last night, the judge began, his voice carrying the same calm authority it held in his courtroom, could have become another headline, another statistic, another reason for our community to lose faith in its institutions. He paused, letting those words settle. But I don't believe that's what any of us wants. He walked to his window, looking out at the city stretching below. I've spent decades in this building, watching case after case come through my courtroom. I've seen how broken relationships between law enforcement and the community can destroy trust on both sides. But I've also seen how genuine understanding can rebuild it. Turning back to face the group, he continued, that's why I'm not filing a complaint. Instead, I'm proposing something that might actually make a difference. The relief on the young officer's face was visible, but it quickly turned to attention as the judge continued speaking. The chief straightened in his chair, clearly intrigued. I want to work with your department to develop a new training program, the judge explained. Not just another mandatory diversity seminar that everyone sits through and forgets. Something real, something that addresses the root causes of what happened last night. He picked up a folder from his desk, notes he'd made during his sleepless night. I'm thinking about a program that pairs officers with community leaders, judges, and civil rights attorneys. Real conversations about real experiences. Ride-alongs that go both ways, officers experiencing the community's perspective and community members understanding the challenges officers face. The chief nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. That's not what I expected when I got the call this morning. Sometimes the unexpected solution is exactly what we need, the judge replied. He turned to the young officer, who sat up straighter under his gaze. Officer, would you be willing to be part of this? To share your experience, to learn from it, to help others learn from it. The young officer blinked in surprise. He'd clearly been expecting punishment, not an invitation to be part of the solution. Yes, Your Honor. I would. His voice grew stronger as he continued. What happened last night? I've been thinking about it all night. About why I did what I did, about the assumptions I made. The judge nodded encouragingly. That kind of honest self-reflection is exactly what this program needs. We're not looking to shame anyone. We're looking to create real change. The lieutenant spoke up for the first time. I've been on the force for 20 years, Your Honor. We've tried programs before, but this feels different. Having someone of your position directly involved. It's not about my position, the judge interrupted gently. It's about creating a space where everyone involved can speak honestly about their experiences and expectations, where we can acknowledge our biases and work to overcome them. He walked back to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. Send in Mr. Chen, please, he said to his clerk. Moments later, a man in a sharp suit entered, the police department's training director. What I'm seeing here isn't just about one traffic stop or one officer's decision, he explained, looking directly at the younger officer. It's about patterns, assumptions, and the gap between law enforcement and the community they serve. But it's also about the possibility of bridging that gap. The lieutenant nodded slowly, beginning to understand where the judge was going with this. The younger officer's rigid posture had softened slightly, his defensive expression giving way to something that looked more like genuine attention. I'd like to set up a meeting, the judge continued. Not for a reprimand, but for a discussion. About what happened here tonight, yes, but more importantly, about what we can learn from it. About how we can do better. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out one of his business cards, holding it out not to the lieutenant, but to the younger officer. The card hung between them for a moment, more than just a piece of paper with contact information. It was an offering. A chance to transform what could have been another tragic headline into something constructive. The younger officer reached out slowly and took it, his hand trembling slightly. Tomorrow morning, my chambers, 9 a.m., the judge said. Both of you. He looked between the officers. Sometimes the best lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. What matters is what we choose to do with them. The senior officer's footsteps splashed through puddles as he approached the scene, his experience evident in his unhurried but purposeful stride. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle now, and the red and blue lights from the police cruisers painted everything in alternating colors, creating an almost surreal atmosphere on the wet street. What's the situation here? The senior officer asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also a hint of curiosity. He shined his flashlight briefly into the car, and that's when everything changed. His eyes widened with recognition, and he quickly lowered the beam. "Your Honor." The senior officer's voice held a mix of surprise and something else, respect, maybe even a touch of embarrassment. "I didn't realize. I know you from the Thompson case last month. That ruling you made about community policing initiatives." The first officer's demeanor shifted instantly. His hand, which had been hovering near his holster, dropped to his side. The color drained from his face as he realized he had been aggressively confronting one of the most respected judges in the district, the same judge who regularly presided over police conduct cases. The judge kept his phone steady, still recording. "Good evening, Lieutenant," he said calmly, recognizing the senior officer's rank. "I was just explaining to your officer that I'd like to know the reason for this stop. I've just left the courthouse after a long day in session." The lieutenant turned to the first officer, his expression demanding an explanation. The younger officer shuffled his feet, suddenly finding his shoes incredibly interesting. I thought the vehicle looked suspicious," he mumbled, the weakness of the explanation hanging in the damp air. "Suspicious?" the lieutenant repeated, his tone making it clear he expected more. "It's a nice car in this neighborhood, and I thought—" The officer's voice trailed off as he realized how his explanation sounded. The judge's judicial parking permit gleamed under the streetlight, making the situation even more uncomfortable. The judge watched this exchange through his window, noting every reaction, every shift in body language. He'd seen similar scenes play out in his courtroom countless times, the moment when assumptions crumbled, when biases were laid bare. But he wasn't interested in humiliation. That wouldn't solve anything. "Lieutenant," the judge spoke up, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in court, "I'd like to suggest something constructive here." He finally turned off his phone's recording and stepped out of his car, his movements slow and deliberate. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, but the air still felt charged with tension. Both officers stood straighter as the judge emerged. Standing at his full height, briefcase still in hand, he cut an impressive figure, not just because of his position, but because of the calm authority he carried naturally. "This situation could go several ways," he continued, looking between the two officers. "We could file reports, launch investigations, make headlines." He paused, letting that possibility sink in. The younger officer visibly swallowed. "Or we could turn this into a learning opportunity." The lieutenant's eyebrows rose with interest. He'd been on the force long enough to know that judges rarely offered alternatives to formal complaints in situations like this. The younger officer looked up, confusion mixing with relief on his face. "Sir, The young officer started to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "I've spent 25 years on the bench," the judge said, his voice taking on the tone he used when mentoring young law clerks. "I've seen how these incidents can either divide us further or bring about real change. Right now, we have a choice to make." A car drove past slowly, its passengers craning their necks to see what was happening. The judge waited until it passed before continuing. The moment felt important, like a pivot point where something significant could either break or begin. The senior officer's footsteps drew closer, and the judge could hear the low murmur of conversation between the two law enforcement officials. The rain continued its steady rhythm, but something in the air had changed. The next few moments would determine whether this would be just another incident report or whether it would become something more. A catalyst for the kind of change the justice system desperately needed. In his mind, the judge was already composing the letter he would write to the police chief tomorrow. Not a complaint, exactly, but an opportunity, a chance to transform this moment of tension into something constructive. Because after 25 years on the bench, he had learned that real change didn't come from punishment alone. It came from confronting uncomfortable truths and being willing to learn from them. The beam of the flashlight swept through the car's interior, casting harsh shadows across the leather seats. The judge sat perfectly still, his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as he'd advised countless young people to do during his community outreach programs. The irony of his current situation wasn't lost on him. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through the steady drumming of rain. There was no "good evening" or explanation for the stop, just a command that brooked no argument. The judge could feel the weight of the officer's stare, heavy with preconceptions. "Of course, officer," the judge replied, keeping his voice steady and professional. "I'm going to reach for my wallet now. It's in my inside jacket pocket." He narrated his movements clearly, a habit born from years of understanding how quickly situations could escalate. The leather wallet felt cool in his hands as he carefully extracted his credentials. The officer snatched the documents without a word, the beam of his flashlight still trained uncomfortably on the judge's face. Water dripped from the officer's hat onto the car's door, forming small pools that reflected the flashing lights behind them. "Step out of the vehicle," came the next command, even before the officer had properly examined the credentials in his hand. The judge took a deep breath. "Officer, I'd like to know the reason for this stop first." His voice remained calm but firm, the same tone he used in his courtroom when maintaining order. "I've been following all traffic laws, and I don't believe there's any probable cause for this stop." The officer's posture stiffened. "Sir, I said step out of the vehicle." His hand moved closer to his holster, a subtle movement that spoke volumes. "This is a routine traffic stop, and you will comply." The judge felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. How many times had he heard similar stories in his courtroom? How many cases had crossed his bench where routine traffic stops became something else entirely? But this time, he wasn't hearing about it from the bench. He was living it. Reaching for his phone on the dashboard, the judge spoke clearly. "Officer, I'm going to record this interaction for both our safety." He could see the officer's jaw clench in the reflection of his side mirror. "I'm also going to call for a supervisor to be present." The rain intensified, drumming harder against the car roof. In the distance, another police cruiser's lights appeared, responding to what the judge assumed was the officer's own call for backup. The situation was escalating, but not in the way the officer might have expected. As the judge began calmly documenting each procedural violation, the lack of probable cause, the failure to state the reason for the stop, the immediate escalation, he could see the officer becoming increasingly agitated. But years of handling high-pressure situations in his courtroom had taught him the power of remaining composed. "Sir, if you don't step out of the vehicle right now..." The officer's threat hung unfinished in the rain-soaked air. The judge continued his steady documentation. "Officer, I'm exercising my legal rights. I'm not resisting, but I am requesting proper procedure be followed." He gestured to his judicial parking permit, clearly visible on the windshield. "I'd also like to point out that I'm coming directly from the courthouse, where I serve as a district judge." The officer's flashlight beam wavered slightly. In that brief moment of hesitation, the judge saw something shift in the officer's expression, not quite recognition, not quite respect, but perhaps the first crack in the wall of assumptions. The second police cruiser pulled up behind the first, its lights adding to the dramatic scene. The judge could see curious faces peering from the few cars that slowly drove past. Some had stopped to record the incident on their phones, another sign of how times had changed. What once might have gone unnoticed was now being documented from multiple angles. Through his rearview mirror, the judge watched as a senior officer approached, his walk unhurried but purposeful through the rain. The atmosphere was about to shift again, but the judge kept his phone steady, recording every moment. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever faced similar treatment but lacked the position or platform to challenge it. The courthouse steps were quiet that evening as most of the staff had already headed home. The smell of rain hung heavy in the air, and dark clouds loomed overhead, promising a storm. Judge Wilson, one of the most respected figures in the city's judicial system, finally stepped out of his chambers after a grueling 12-hour day. He had just wrapped up a complex criminal trial that had kept him in court far longer than usual. His shoulders felt heavy with exhaustion. The weight of the day's testimonies, the careful deliberations, and the responsibility of ensuring justice was served had taken their toll. Still, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had given every detail the attention it deserved. 25 years on the bench had taught him that justice wasn't just about decisions, it was about dignity, fairness, and giving every person their rightful day in court. As he walked to his car in the judiciary parking lot, his footsteps echoed against the concrete. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars remained, their surfaces glistening with the first drops of rain. His black BMW sedan sat where it always did, in the spot marked with Chief District Judge, a position he had earned through decades of unwavering commitment to the law. The judge placed his worn leather briefcase, filled with case files he planned to review over the weekend, in the passenger seat. Despite his tiredness, he couldn't help but smile at the small photo of his grandkids tucked into the side pocket. It reminded him why he did this job, to make their world a little bit better, a little more just. The engine purred to life, and he eased out of the parking lot, his mind already drifting to the quiet evening ahead. Maybe he'd finally have time to read that new legal biography his daughter had given him last month. The streetlights were just starting to flicker on, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. He noticed the police cruiser about 3 blocks from the courthouse. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police cars were common downtown, especially near the judicial buildings. But something felt different about this one. Through his rearview mirror, he watched as it followed his every turn, maintaining the same careful distance. 4 blocks, 5 blocks, 6 blocks. The cruiser stayed with him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. Judge Wilson kept his speed steady, exactly at the limit, his hands positioned carefully at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, habits ingrained from years of teaching his own children how to drive. The flash of red and blue lights finally came as he turned onto Oak Street. His heart sank, not from fear, but from a deep, weary recognition. Even with his judicial parking permit clearly displayed on his windshield, even in his suit and tie, even after spending his entire career upholding the law, some things hadn't changed. He pulled over smoothly, positioning his car precisely where it should be, close to the curb, but not too close. The rain was falling steadily now, drumming against the roof of his car. Through his side mirror, he could see the officer approaching, one hand resting near his holster, a detail that didn't escape the judge's notice. Years of experience had taught him to stay calm in tense situations. He reached slowly for his wallet, keeping his hands visible at all times. The document holder inside contained not just his driver's license, but also his judicial credentials, though he wondered if they would make any difference tonight. The tap on his window was sharp, authoritative. As he pressed the button to lower it, the cool night air rushed in, bringing with it the scent of rain and asphalt. Water dripped from the officer's hat brim as he leaned down, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Judge Wilson could feel his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady as he prepared to speak. 25 years of commanding respect in his courtroom, yet here he was, about to face a very different kind of authority. The irony wasn't lost on him. This moment, he knew, would test everything he believed about justice, about change, about the very system he had dedicated his life to serving. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky. It was going to be a long night, but not for the reasons he had planned. As the officer's flashlight beam swept across his face, Judge Wilson took a deep breath, knowing that what happened next would matter not just for him, but for everyone who would come after.